Like, do I think this story was the best it could have been? No, not by a long shot. But did it make me cry, and will it stick with me for a long, long time? Yeah, weirdly enough. Hi, hello. I've returned with a much more normal length book review this time. It's possible. I am capable of being succinct, somewhat. Today I want to talk about House with Good Bones by T. Kingfisher. This is a book that I had very mixed feelings about, and I wanted to talk about why that is. You want to say hi? We'll see if she makes it into any of the shots. My cat is here. And she's a black cat, so she kind of fits the spooky vibes of the book. Well, we'll see. She's just gonna be hanging out nights with just the two. Let's start off with just reading the synopsis from Goodreads. I'm just gonna pull it up on my phone and read it. Hello, my cat's licking my elbow. Mom seems off. Her brother's words echo in Sam Montgomery's ear as she turns onto the quiet North Carolina street where their mother lives alone. She brushes the thought away as she climbs the front steps. Sam's excited for this rare extended visit and looking forward to nights with just the two of them, drinking boxed wine, watching murder mystery shows, and guessing who the killer is long before the characters figure it out. False advertising. They never accurately guess who the killer is, I don't think. That's not a big deal, though. But stepping inside, she quickly realizes home isn't what it used to be. Gone is the warm, cluttered charm her mom is known for. Now the walls are painted a sterile white. Her mom jumps at the smallest noises and looks over her shoulder even when she's the only person in the room. And when Sam steps out back to clear her head, she finds a jar of teeth hidden beneath the magazine-worthy rose bushes, and vultures are circling the garden from above. To find out what's got her mom so frightened in her own home, Sam will go digging for the truth. But some secrets are better left buried. A haunting Southern Gothic from an award-winning master of suspense, A House with Good Bones explores the dark, twisted roots lurking just beneath the veneer of a perfect home and family. Ooh, spooky. Now, unfortunately, this review is going to have just light spoilers throughout the whole thing and then heavy spoilers at the end. I thought about creating a first part that was spoiler-free, but it turned out that everything I wanted to talk about is at least somewhat of a spoiler for the story. So proceed at your own discretion. This is a very short book. I believe the audiobook was just under 7 hours long, and I do recommend it. The narrator was great. I tend to be pretty picky about that kind of thing, and I think she captured the voice of the protagonist really well. T. Kingfisher is one of those authors that I'm aware has a pretty loyal following. I read Nettle and Bone at the beginning of this year, I think, and I loved it. And this is my second T. Kingfisher novel, and I see why people really love her. And I really only have good things to say about this book, except for one major complaint, but it's a really major complaint. But let's start with the many good things, which I've kind of loosely siloed into categories. I'm going to be talking about the plot throughout this, but I'm not going to give a full plot summary. I think the synopsis gives you an idea of what we're working with, and then I will touch on the elements that are relevant. But yeah, let's talk about just the many things I did really like about this book. Number one, characters. This book works within a pretty tight cast of characters, which is a wise choice considering how short it is. The main character of A House with Good Bones is a 32-year-old woman named Sam Montgomery. She is an archaeoentomologist, which is an insect archaeologist. And just as an aside, I'm not a scientist, but it seemed to me that Kingfisher did her research into entomology. Sam is influenced by her work and by the knowledge from her work in ways that feel very lived in and realistic rather than just having random bug facts sprinkled into the book. But that's kind of a side note. I really can't speak much to the science in this book because I'm not an authority on that. Sam is delightful. I really love reading a 32-year-old protagonist. This is a grown woman with a PhD and a career, and that comes with a level of self-confidence and emotional stability that is really refreshing in kind of the current book landscape. But that's not to say that she's boring. Sam is very witty, and she's curious about the world around her, and there's a very particular kind of fun you can have with a character who's a fully grown adult. After her first night staying at her mom's house, she wakes up, and she has this terrible, irrational fear that she's 10 years old again, and that her whole adult life was some crazy dream, and now she has to relive it all. She has to relive high school and college and young adulthood, and that was so real. I think you reach a certain point at adulthood where being young again, you can romanticize it, but would you really want to go back? Like, I wouldn't. Sam is also fat. She very openly identifies herself as fat, and this isn't treated as a point of angst or insecurity for her character. In fact, later in the book, when someone tries to use her size to make her feel bad, she points out that there are much worse ways to hurt her feelings. Which is not to say that there's anything wrong with books where there's a character who comes to terms with their own body image and goes on a journey of self-acceptance and recognizing that they are just as valuable and just as deserving of dignity and love as anyone else in the world. Those books can be very valuable, but I recently watched a book review by Reads with Rachel, and I can't remember what book she was reviewing, so if I remember, I'll put the link to it in the description. But in that book review, she mentioned wanting more books where there are just adult characters who are fat, who are going on adventures and falling in love and experiencing life, and like their body image and self-worth journey is not always just the central kind of conflict and arc of the story. So that review was fresh on my mind as I went into reading this book, and I really appreciated the way Sam's character was presented. And it didn't feel like tokenized or fetishized, it just felt like an organic part of her character. The supporting characters are also great. Sam's mom, I think her name is like Evelyn or Evie or something, but I could be totally wrong about that because she's mostly called Mom throughout the story because it's from Sam's point of view. So I don't remember her name, so sorry. But Sam's mom is immediately very easy to care about, which is important because her and Sam's relationship is like the beating heart at the center of the story. She's this spunky, anxious, progressive woman living in rural North Carolina. She leaves sticky notes all over the house with notes to herself and keeps a very meticulous planner. She very clearly loves her daughter, and as the synopsis of the book says, they spend time drinking box wine and watching murder mysteries together. Like, what's not to love? She's great. We also have Phil, the handyman slash gardener for Sam's mom. This is only my second T. Kingfisher novel, but so far, love the way she writes men. She knocks it out of the park. They feel like real human beings, not just like jangling knapsacks of stereotypes and tropes. I'm going to circle back to Phil in a few minutes, so let's just put a little pin in him, but he's there. We also have Gail, a neighbor who turns out to be a witch. I'm not really going to explain this in more detail because the story doesn't go into much more detail, frankly. And we have Mr. Presley, I think his name is. I listened to this audiobook, so some of my retention of names specifically, rough. But Mr. Presley, I think his name is, he's Phil's father, and he's like the grumpy old man that watches the street with his binoculars. There's a scene where Sam visits Mr. Presley's house because she wants to go talk to Phil, who doesn't live there, to be clear. Phil is also a fully grown adult. He just like visits the neighborhood to do yard work and handiwork and stuff. But she goes to Mr. Presley's house to talk to Phil, and there's like a ton of deadbolts on his door, and he's listening to some radio program about all the groups that are threatening America. And for some reason, the Amish are like one of the groups mentioned, and it's kind of this running gag. It's very funny, and I think T. Kingfisher seems to very much understand the culture of the South, but I'll get there. I'll get there in a little bit. And those are pretty much the characters. Sam's dead grandmother also has a pretty big presence in the story, but we're going to talk about her in a little bit. We're just kind of laying the groundwork right now. Okay, number 2, character relationships. Yes, I'm giving this a category of its own, even though we just talked about characters. I won't spend a ton of time on it, but it feels deserving of its own category. As I said, Sam and her mother's relationship is very sweet and very believable. You really do care about them pretty much right from the jump. I think anyone who has a mother who has tried to do better than her parents and has tried to build a very different kind of life for her family than the one she had would really appreciate this depiction of a mother-child relationship. Okay, and this is not a romance story. I don't want to be misleading, but I loved Sam and Phil. Sam is sleeping on the couch when Phil comes over to like do some stuff around the house, and she thinks he's an intruder because no men live in the house, right? And so she threatens to shoot him, and that's how they meet. That's their little meet cute. The conversation that really characterizes their relationship for me, and to be clear, again, I don't necessarily mean romantic relationship. It's hinted at the end of the book that there will be a romantic relationship, but there's not one in the story. But anyways, the conversation that really characterizes their relationship to me is when they're at a garden party at a neighbor's house. Phil asks her about her work, which again, insect archaeology. He asks kind of a joking question about her job being like Jurassic Park, where they discover like the mosquitoes in amber. And she thinks about how she's asked this question so often that she's literally developed a script for it, because that's like the first thing people think of when they hear about her job. And the script usually ends with people losing interest and moving on from the conversation, or like changing the topic. But he breaks script and asks her what specific kind of weevils she's found, because she mentioned something about, I think, her dissertation being on weevils. And she's really surprised by this. And they have a more in-depth conversation about her work. And she learns that he's a master gardener. So he's like genuinely interested in insects. And he's also just interested in her studies. This reminds me, maybe this is just like a personal thing for me. This reminds me a lot of when my now husband and I like first started getting to know each other. I used to wear a lot of rings, like 5 or 6 rings. And they all had significance to me. They were from like, I used to, when I would travel, I would try to get a ring from every place that I would travel to. And I remember him asking me what my rings meant. And I was no one had ever asked me that before. Like I had told people before, like, oh yeah, these are significant to me for these reasons. But he just asked me, like, do your rings mean something to you? Are they significant to you? And just that feeling of like, oh, this person cares about me to the point that they want to know these little details. So that conversation may not strike the same chord for other people, but it just struck me as very sweet and a very kind of precious way to build that relationship. There's also this scene where he's overdoing some work on the house and he's like tinkering with stuff around her as Sam is researching her like crazy great-grandfather, and she's just intermittently telling him wild facts about her great-grandfather's life while he's, working on stuff around her. And he's understandably very fascinated by kind of the ongoing saga of Sam's family. And I don't know, there's this very kind of cozy companionship built in their interactions with one another that I really love, and I feel like is such a fundamental part of healthy relationships in real life, but is often lacking from stories portraying like budding romances. And so I really treasured that part of the book. This is a story that ultimately is very much about family dynamics. So I don't want it to seem like I'm leaving that out, but we're going to get really into the detail with that near the end of this video. So, okay, loose silo of good things, number 3, setting and style. This book is set in North Carolina and mostly takes place in this one like small rural neighborhood. I'm not going to get very far into it, but like I said, I do think Kingfisher really understands the culture of the South. Sam has this whole internal monologue about how she grew up going to Piggly Wiggly, but now there's a Food Lion, and that's like a huge step up, which is so real. I was raised in the Pacific Northwest, but I currently live in the South. Cultural differences, very big. And the difference between a Piggly Wiggly and a Food Lion, they're worlds apart. But I mostly bring up the setting so we can talk about what it means for a story to be Southern Gothic, because this book does advertise itself as a Southern Gothic story, and I think it fulfills that fairly well. Southern Gothic is a literary style that takes Gothic themes and places them in a magical, realist American South setting. I was going to do... I was going to like put a little academic article here about Southern Gothic style. And then I had a really tiring week at work where I was reading a lot of dense academic articles for most of my day. I'm a researcher, that's my job. And so I'm not going to. I'm going to give you a list of things from Wikipedia. And if you want to learn more about Southern Gothic and like the literary style and literary critique surrounding it, you can do that on your own time. But some things we expect from Southern Gothic literature are a distinctly Southern setting, check, that's in this book. A tension between realistic and supernatural elements, again, check. Although at the end of the book, I do wish the story had actually stayed more rooted in realism. A blurred line between victim and villain, which is somewhat achieved in the character of the grandmother, but we'll get there. Exploration of the continuing pressure of the past upon the present, check. This is like the central conflict and mystery of the story. And exposing the myth of the old antebellum South, especially its narrative of an idyllic past hidden by social, familial, and racial denials and suppressions. This is kind of achieved. I honestly don't have a lot to compare this book to. Southern Gothic is not a literary style I tend to read in, so I'm curious. I'm curious to see if there's any reviews from people who like that's their wheelhouse to see how it kind of stacks up in the literary style itself. But if this is a style that you tend to enjoy, you might really like this book. My one critique in this specific arena is that I wish Kingfisher had leaned a bit more into atmosphere. When I think of Gothic literature, not even just Southern Gothic, but just Gothic literature in general, I think of a very specific kind of spooky, mysterious atmosphere that straddles that line between realism and the supernatural, and I'm not sure this story always achieves that. Like, there's things happening in the plot that build suspense, which I'll talk about in a minute, but the setting slash ambiance and Sam's voice don't always lend themselves very well to building a Gothic atmosphere. Now, there's a lot more positive things I could say about this book. It's a very fun read. Sam's voice is really enjoyable. There's a lot of very clever details in the story that make it feel very grounded in reality. And I actually did laugh out loud a few times while listening to it, which isn't like a common reading experience for me. Now, Emma, you might be saying, you've mostly been singing the praises of this book. It sounds great. Why do you have complicated feelings about it? Well, I didn't for about 75 to 80% of the book. I was having a great time. I was really enjoying myself. The suspense was building really well. I was really intrigued by the family dynamics and the weird stuff happening around the house. And then suddenly the story went off the rails into the supernatural. So let's just briefly walk through how Kingfisher builds suspense and then where I think it falls short. We know things are off pretty much right from the moment Sam arrives at her mom's house. For one thing, there's a vulture perched on the mailbox. And then when she goes inside the house, she notices that every room has been painted white. Now, Sam's mom inherited this house from her mother, so Sam's grandmother. And the grandmother was very controlling, I would say abusive, and she was obsessed with having this normal, proper life. When the house became Sam's mom's, they painted every room like warm, colorful, fun colors. So obviously, it's very strange that now it's all boring white again. And then she notices the painting above the mantle. This is one of the running gags of the book that I actually think works really well. Her grandmother was racist in many ways, some of which are explored in the text. And one of the like kind of simple ways that that comes across in the book is that the grandmother adored this painting of a young couple getting married, and it's like a very kind of romantic painting, but the man is in a Confederate uniform. And when the house became Sam's mom's, they took the painting down because they hated it, and they called it the Lost Cause painting. And it like comes up throughout the story, and at one point Sam refers to it as Lost Cause, the matrimony edition, which made me laugh. Sam's mom replaced this painting with a picture of like a fish, like a big picture of a fish that has a kind of insect in it that Sam really loves. And so they always call it the Helgamite painting because it's the insect that's in it. But when Sam gets to her mom's house, she notices that the Lost Cause painting is hanging up again. And she's like, whoa, Mom, you hate that painting. Why did you hang it back up? And her mom acts really weird about it. And she's like, oh, I wouldn't say I hated it. And Sam's like, whoa, what's going on? And from this moment, we keep building this sense of things being off, things being not quite right. And Kingfisher does it really successfully. For example, Sam goes outside to the house's rose garden, which is this like incredible, I think the synopsis describes it as a magazine-worthy rose garden, right? And she can't find a single insect in it. No bees, no aphids, no spiders, not a single bug. This is really off-putting. As a reader, it's so interesting how something so simple just strikes a chord in you that like, that's so wrong. Gardens should be full of bugs. Vultures keep congregating around their house. Sam wakes up and her room is swarming with ladybugs, even though she couldn't find a single bug outside in the rose garden. She has this kind of sleep paralysis experience where something claw-like is combing through her hair and there's a creepy voice saying, "Little piggy, the roses say to say your prayers." She wakes up at one point from a nap covered in rose petals. There's a family picture hanging in the house, and like Sam's seen it 100 times, but she looks closer and she's like, is that? And there's a child's hand, like a pale child's hand, reaching out of the rose bushes towards Sam's ankle. And in a phone call with her brother, who's barely in the book at all, I think they have like 2 phone calls, but in a phone call with her brother, she remembers this time when she was a child that her grandmother made her close her hands on the thorns of a rose bush and told her to let them taste you. This is all really interesting and very suspense building, just the increasing sense of things being wrong. And Sam is a scientist. She's very rational. She wants to believe that there's an explanation for everything. So this all worries her, but she keeps trying to explain it in rational terms. And this is done in a way that feels very realistic rather than like, you're reading a character who's just stupid and can't figure out what's going on around them. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like a very realistic example of a person who has, no frame of reference for the supernatural existing, suddenly having to grapple with things seeming supernatural, but surely there must be an explanation. Like the funniest example of her, rationalizing these things going on around her is when she wakes up after a nap covered in rose petals, and she had another one of those creepy sleep paralysis experiences where there was like something combing her hair and talking to her, and her ear is bleeding. But those are things she can't really explain, right? So she fixates on the rose petals specifically, and there's like a trail of them going out onto the porch and into the rose garden. And she hears Phil, the handyman, working on something outside. And so she jumps to conclusions. She's freaked out. She charges at him angrily and is like, do you think this is romantic? And he's like, hello? What are you talking about? So we have this slow building suspense that I think is really well done. And then we have these hints of the supernatural. Like Sam's mother very clearly seems to believe that her mother, so Sam's grandmother, is still around, haunting the house. And Sam remembers how her grandmother always used to talk about these underground children as kind of like a boogeyman story. Like, the children who don't listen to grandmother will get taken by the underground children. And then partway through the book, Sam learns that her great-grandfather, so her grandmother's dad, we're going 4 generations, he made news as like a weird occultist who was trying to create human life in weird magic ways. So again, there's like these hints of the supernatural, but none of them properly prepare the reader for how fully off the rails the book goes suddenly, like 80% of the way in. This is the problem with stories that have slow, suspenseful builds. You have to make sure that once the payoff hits, it's worth it and it feels believable and satisfying. Suddenly, and I do mean suddenly, Sam's grandmother appears in the house made of roses. And from this point on, it's all crazy. They have to like fight her off. The neighbor Gail, who's apparently a witch, shows up and sprays the grandmother with weed killer. Yes, really. And the grandmother warns them like, I'm the thing protecting you from the underground children. You're going to have to deal with them if I leave. And they're like, we want you to leave. We hate you. Goodbye. And so she like dies and leaves. And then their house like falls underground and there's no light and there's dirt everywhere and the underground children are here. They're these like creepy, malformed humanoid things that have a film over their eyes and perfectly round mouths with no teeth, and they want to eat them. Oh, and they mewl like kittens too, which is, the creepiness is good, right? It is creepy. It achieves that. So it turns out that Sam's great-grandfather had been trying to create children with magic, and obviously they turned out really wrong and really bad. And so, of course, they have to defeat the underground children, and they do so by Sam grasping a rose bush and commanding it to burn them. So she has like some of the magic that her grandmother had. Oh, which I did not explain. So her grandmother was magical and like poured so much of herself into her roses and built basically a barrier of protection around the house so that they kept the underground children at bay even once she died. So anyways, Sam commands the roses to burn the underground children, and they do. If this sounds confusing to you, that's because it is. At this point, I found myself really disappointed and a little frustrated by the way the story was ending. There were also a lot of things that were never really explained. Like, for example, Sam digs up a jar of teeth from the garden, And the grandmother says something about that having been part of the protective barrier she made around the house, but we never find out whose teeth they are or why that would be protective in some way, or if there's like, are there jars of teeth all the way around the house? Was that the only jar? I don't know. The book is really not helped by how short it is. Even though I think a lot of books today could benefit from being shorter, actually, and from like being more heavily edited and having things cut out, this is a book I would actually argue needed to be longer. We needed the suspense to rise more and to transition more organically into like the full-blown magical supernatural stuff. And what's disappointing is that I actually have some really simple suggestions for how that transition could have been done more naturally. And I'm not even like, I'm not a developmental editor. I'm not in the publishing industry. And so the fact that like off the top of my head, I could come up with a few things that would make this work more seamlessly is disappointing because it clearly could have been workshopped a little bit more. Like, I really don't think it would have been all that complex to build more suspense. For example, the great grandfather being a like sorcerer occultist should have come up way earlier. Maybe Sam even could have grown up hearing stories about her weird sorcerer great grandpa, and I don't think it would have changed that much about the plot, but it would have introduced this element a lot earlier. Also, Sam digging up the jar of teeth is kind of the last straw before her grandmother appears, so it should be treated with a bit more gravity in the story. And to be clear, I'm talking about the supernatural here, right? Because Sam, as a person, is very freaked out by the jar of teeth. And when she shows it to her mom is also freaked out and like breaks down crying. But there should have been like a hint of the supernatural in all of this, not just like this is a disturbing thing we found in our yard. Like if Sam is somehow breaking a protective barrier to the house and that's what causes the grandmother to show up, she should feel that somehow, especially because she apparently has this magical connection. There should be some supernatural indicator of something changing and heightening when this jar of teeth is removed. There are probably some other ways that the supernatural could have been integrated more seamlessly. These are just some simple suggestions that came to mind in like 2 seconds. But I can't emphasize enough how jarring it is to enter that final act and suddenly everything is supernatural. Okay, Emma, you may say, I think I understand why your feelings about this book are a bit conflicted. But wait, that's not all, because suddenly, near the end of the book, I started crying. I suddenly understood what Kingfisher was doing with the themes of the book and what these different supernatural elements represented allegorically, and it just hit me so hard. It made me really emotional. This is a book about generational wounds. Bear with me here. Sam's great-grandfather was an awful dad. He neglected his daughter and poured all of his time and energy into creating these magical children that turned out to be a total curse upon the family. Sam's grandmother spent her childhood lonely and hurt and neglected and watching her father try to create children when he already had one. And so as she got older, she turned that hurt into defensiveness, and she used her magic to build these barriers that technically protected her family, but really only kept the underground children at bay for a time. And because her father had been so neglectful and her childhood had not been what she wanted it to be, she had this idealized vision in her head of a normal, proper family. She forced this vision on her children in ways that were deeply hurtful. She was incredibly controlling and verbally abusive, and she continued to be abusive to her grandchildren as well. The underground children represent, quite literally, the baggage we inherit from our ancestors. And it's not just dead weight, it's living and painful and vicious. The rose bushes, which are the grandmother's coping response to these wounds, are beautiful and admirable from the outside, but constricting and painful, and they draw blood, just like the life the grandmother tries to force on her children. Sam's mother's response to this, we find out, was to go off to college and learn more about the world and learn compassion for people who aren't like her and learn that she doesn't need to live this very cookie cutter, sterile, proper life in order to be fulfilled and accepted and loved. This is represented by her house, by the fun colors and clutter and quirky art she decorates with. But she still lives in great fear of her mother even once she's passed. She is literally haunted by the vengeful and exacting ghost of her mother. At the climax of the story, Sam has to be pierced by the thorns and feel all the pain and loneliness and rage her grandmother had poured into those rose bushes. For the first time in her life, she understands why her grandmother was the way she was. And she says, I could not pity the adult she had become, but I could pity the girl she had been. And it is only through this understanding, not total excusing, that Sam is able to burn away the underground children and release her family from this curse that has followed them. This is a book about breaking cycles, and it was at the line that I read above about not pitying the adult she had become, but the girl she had once been, that I started crying. In conclusion, this book is a great example of why the star rating system for books is rarely useful. Like, do I think this story was the best it could have been? No, not by a long shot. But did it make me cry, and will it stick with me for a long, long time? Yeah, weirdly enough. Well, that's it. It's nice filming a review that's not almost 2 hours long. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you read this book? How did you feel about it? If you haven't read this book, what are your thoughts just based on my summary of it? Thanks so much for being here, and I'll see you again whenever I see you again. Bye!